The paper was so worn it had gone soft as cloth, folded into a square no bigger than a playing card and tucked into the toe of her left boot, where she had kept it for 7 years without a single day of exception. Ada Langston had read the name on that paper so many times she could have traced the letters in the dark, in the rain, half asleep in the back of a moving wagon with her teeth rattling together from the ruts in the road. Andrew Ashford. 2 words. 11 letters total, if you counted carefully, which she had, more times than she would ever admit to a living soul. She had pressed her thumb to the ink when it was still damp, back in the spring of 1876, standing in the front parlor of her aunt's house in Richmond, Virginia, while the magnolias were blooming pink outside the window and the whole world smelled like something sweet that was already dying. The man who had given her the paper was her father's old business partner, a retired land surveyor named Fletcher Doyle, who visited twice a year and brought hard candy from the city. He had pressed the folded note into her palm with a crooked finger and said, in that slow way of his, "If the world ever stops making sense to you, girl, that name belongs to a man in the New Mexico territory who will treat you fairly. He is your father's word of honor made into a person. You remember that." She had been 22 then, still young enough to think that Richmond would hold her, still young enough to believe that the world making sense was something you could count on. The world had stopped making sense the following autumn. Her father passed of a fever in October of 1876, and by November, the business he had left behind had fallen into debt that Ada had not known about and could not pay. Her mother had died when Ada was 9, which meant there was no one left to absorb the blow with her, no one to sit across the supper table and say it would be all right. Her aunt offered her a room and a quiet expectation that she would eventually marry some clerk from the city, but Ada Langston had never been built for quiet expectations. She had her father's straight back and her mother's restless eyes, and she could not make herself fit into the small shape that room wanted her to fill. She thought about the paper in her boot on the night her aunt told her that the charitable arrangement would last only until Christmas. She thought about it the next morning when she woke before dawn and lay still in the dark, listening to her own breathing. She thought about it when she went to the post office and bought a stamp with the last coins in her pocket and wrote a careful, dignified letter to Mr. Andrew Ashford of the New Mexico territory, explaining who she was and who her father had been and what Fletcher Doyle had told her, and asking plainly whether the offer of fair treatment still stood. She mailed the letter and told herself she was being practical, not desperate. She went back to her aunt's house and kept the paper in her boot and waited. His reply came 6 weeks later, in January of 1877. It was written in a clean, strong hand on paper that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. He said that yes, he remembered her father well and held him in the highest esteem. He said that he ran a cattle ranch outside a town called Calla Ridge in the southeastern corner of the New Mexico territory, and that the territory was no place for a woman alone, but that if she was serious about a new life and willing to work hard, he could offer her honest work as a housekeeper and cook until she found her footing. He said he was 28 years old, unmarried, and ran the operation with 2 ranch hands and a cook who was getting on in years and had been asking to retire since the previous spring. He did not promise her love or adventure. He promised her fair wages, a room of her own, and the kind of honesty that her father had always represented to him. She folded his letter and put it in her boot next to the one with his name on it. She began saving money. It took her until the spring of 1883 to save enough to make the journey properly. She had worked those 6 years in Richmond doing what work she could find, seamstress work, teaching reading to the children of a Methodist church, taking in laundry when the other jobs ran dry. She wrote to Andrew Ashford twice more in those years, brief letters explaining that she was still coming, that life had simply required more preparation than anticipated. He wrote back both times, always in that same clean hand, always measured and honest, saying the offer still stood and the room was waiting. She had carried his name in her boot for 7 years. She had no way of knowing, as the westbound train pulled out of Richmond on a morning in late April of 1883, that the man she was traveling toward had been standing at the well behind his house in the pale blue light of that same morning, drawing water for the horses, thinking about her letter, wondering if she would actually come. The train took her to St. Louis, and from St. Louis she took another train west to the end of the rail line in southern Colorado, and from there she arranged passage on a southbound freight wagon operated by a wide, weathered man named Hector Cruz, who was hauling dry goods to the merchants along the Pecos corridor. Hector Cruz did not talk much, which Ada found she liked. He drove with a kind of patient authority, handling his mule team with quiet competence, and when the road dipped into arroyos and the wagon tilted sharply, he navigated it without drama or complaint. Ada sat on the bench beside him and watched the land change. She had never seen anything like it. Virginia was green and heavy with humidity, all deep soil and broad-leaf trees and rivers that ran brown and slow between clay banks. But this country was something else entirely. Sky was enormous, bigger than she had understood sky could be, a blue so intense it looked almost solid, and the land beneath it was red and ochre and pale gold, cut through with shadows and distance in a way that made her feel both very small and, strangely, very free. "You are going to Calla Ridge?" Hector asked on the second day, when the silence between them had grown comfortable enough that words fit naturally into it. "To the Ashford ranch outside Calla Ridge," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You know Ashford. I have corresponded with him. I have not met him in person." Hector was quiet for a moment, watching his mules. "He is a straight man," he said finally. "Pays his bills, does not cause trouble with the other ranchers. In this territory, that is more than you can say about half of them." "What is the town like?" she asked. "Calla Ridge." He considered it. 40, maybe 50 families, a general store, a saloon, a church that is not finished yet, a doctor who also pulls teeth. The law is a sheriff named Grady Moss who is fair when he is sober. One main street with a well in the center of it, and the ranches spread out around it like spokes on a wheel. Ada nodded and looked back out at the distance, at the mountains to the west that were still capped with snow even in late April, at the hawks riding the thermals above the mesas with a casual magnificence that made her chest ache with something she could not name. She slept that night in her clothes in the back of the wagon, with her boots on and the paper still tucked inside the left one. And she thought, not for the first time, about what it would mean to arrive somewhere and have that arrival actually be the beginning of something rather than the end. They reached the outskirts of Calla Ridge on the morning of the third day, rolling in along a track that was too rough to be called a road, but too established to be called nothing, past scrub cedar and juniper, and the occasional tall saguaro standing with its arms up like it was surprised to see them. The town materialized slowly, a water tower first, then a rooftop, then the geometry of a main street lined with low wooden buildings that looked like they were concentrating hard on staying upright. Hector Cruz pulled his team to a stop in front of the general store and helped Ada down from the bench with a courteous efficiency that made her think he had daughters somewhere. "The Ashford Ranch is another 2 miles east," he said, jerking his chin in that direction. "If you follow the road past the church foundation, you will see the windmill. That is the one." She thanked him and retrieved her traveling case from the back of the wagon, which was not heavy because she had brought only what she could carry without help. She had intended to walk the 2 miles. She had her boots and her practical skirts, and she was not afraid of distance. But as she turned to orient herself to the town, she noticed the well. It stood in the center of the main street, which was not unusual for a frontier town, but what was unusual was the man standing beside it. He had his back to her. He was tall, lean through the shoulders but broad through them too, dressed in a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers and worn boots that had been resoled at least once. His hat was pushed back on his head in the way of a man who had started the morning early and was in no hurry. He was lowering a bucket into the well with a practiced ease that suggested he had done it 10,000 times, and would do it 10,000 more. Something in Ada Langston went very still. She did not know how she knew. She had no logical reason to know. But the certainty moved through her like water through a crack in stone, quiet and absolute. She walked toward the well. She was 10 feet away when he heard her footsteps on the packed earth and turned, and she saw his face for the first time. He was 34 years old, which she knew from his letter. He had brown eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been assembled with care, and a 3-day beard, and a line across his forehead from the hat. He looked like the land around him, like something that had been shaped by sun and wind and a great deal of time without flinching. He was not classically handsome the way the men in the magazines were handsome. He was better than that. He was real. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has been a long time coming. "You are Ada Langston," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not require height to carry. "And you are Andrew Ashford," she said. A pause. The bucket had come back up and rested on the lip of the well between them, dripping slowly onto the dry ground. He looked at her face for a long moment, without any of the appraising that she had braced herself for, none of the looking up and down that she had experienced from men in Richmond, who thought they had the right to measure her worth with their eyes. He just looked at her face directly, and she looked at his, and it was one of those moments that she would carry for the rest of her life, perfectly preserved like a flower pressed between the pages of a good book. "You made it," he said, and the simplicity of it, the relief that was tucked so carefully behind those 3 words that only a careful person would have caught it, made her throat tighten. "I made it," she said. He lifted the bucket off the lip of the well and said, "My horse is at the livery. I will take your case. I can carry it. I know you can." He held out his hand for it anyway, and she gave it to him, not because she needed to, but because something in the gesture felt like the beginning of an agreement. They walked to the livery together, and she learned that he had come into town that morning for grain and had stopped at the well because his horse had taken a stone in her shoe and needed a few minutes of rest. He said it the way he said most things, in complete sentences without decoration, as if words were meant to do their work without a lot of extra ornamentation. She found she liked that very much. At the livery, he saddled his horse, a gray mare named Cora, who regarded Ada with the wary intelligence of an animal that had seen a great many strangers, and he fastened Ada's case behind the saddle and offered her a hand up onto Cora's back. "I can walk the 2 miles, she said. "You have already walked 1,000 miles to get here," he said. "There is no sense in being stubborn about the last 2. She took his hand and swung up into the saddle, and he led Cora by the reins, walking beside his own horse, which struck her as a thing that told you something about a man. They took the road east out of town, past the church foundation that Hector Cruz had mentioned, and she could see the windmill ahead of them turning slowly in the morning breeze. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 11 years. I came out from Missouri when I was 23, bought the first parcel of land with money I had saved working the railroad, added to it over time." "You built it yourself?" "With help. A man named Dorodio Vargas helped me lay the foundations. He has a place south of here now. We still trade labor when the season calls for it." "Do you have cattle now?" 300 head, mostly Longhorn crossed with some Hereford stock I brought in 2 years ago. "I have 2 hands, Eli Cooper and a young man named Samuel Reed who came to me last fall from Texas." She listened to the information settle into the landscape around her, the particulars of his life taking on shape and dimension. She had built a version of this place in her imagination over 7 years of waiting, and it was both exactly what she had pictured and nothing like it at all. The ranch house came into view as they rounded a shallow bend in the road. It was a low adobe structure with a covered porch across the front, simple and solid, the kind of building that did not pretend to be more than it was. Behind it stood a barn of rough timber, a corral containing 4 horses, a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that had been laid out in straight rows with the kind of attention that suggested the person who planted it believed in order. "The kitchen garden," she said. Old Pete planted it before he left. Pete was the cook I mentioned in my letters. He retired in March. He lives in town now with his daughter's family. He will come out twice a week to check on the garden until someone else learns where things are. I can learn where things are, Ada said. He looked up at her on the horse, and something moved briefly through his expression, something quick and warm that was gone before she could fully name it. I expect you can, he said. He helped her down from the saddle at the porch steps, and she noticed that he did not hold her hand a moment longer than was necessary, and she noticed that she noticed. Inside, the house was clean and sparse and smelled of wood smoke and dried sage. The main room held a table, 4 chairs, a cookstove with a good copper kettle on it, and shelves along one wall lined with practical things, canned goods, tools, a few books. The room that would be hers was at the back of the house, separate from the main sleeping room at the other end, and it had a window that looked out toward the mountains and a narrow bed with a quilt on it that someone had made by hand, the stitches small and careful. Old Pete's wife made that quilt years ago, Andrew said from the doorway. She passed some time back. He left it here. I thought you might as well use it. Ada set her traveling case on the floor beside the bed and looked at the quilt for a moment. Somewhere in all those careful stitches, a woman's hands had done this work, patient and purposeful, and it had survived her. She thought that was a beautiful thing. Thank you, she said, for all of it, the room and the letters and the patience. He was quiet for a moment. You thanked me already in your last letter, he said. You do not need to keep thanking me. She turned and looked at him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and she thought that she would like to know everything about him, which was a thought she had not had about a man in a very long time. All right, she said. Then I will just get to work. He smiled at that. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that a man gives when something strikes him as right, quietly and without ceremony, and it changed his whole face in a way that she felt somewhere in her chest. The first weeks passed the way all first weeks pass in new places, full of small discoveries and adjustments, the learning of where things are kept and how things are done, and what the rhythms of a place feel like when you are inside them. Ada cooked 3 meals a day, learned the kitchen garden from old Pete on his twice-weekly visits, did laundry in the creek basin on wash day, kept accounts in the ledger that Andrew maintained with fastidious care, and gradually made herself indispensable in the way that competent people always do. The 2 ranch hands, Eli Cooper and Samuel Reed, treated her with a respectful wariness that thawed slowly over the first 2 weeks into something warmer. Eli was 40-something and taciturn, a man of few words and enormous capability, the kind of person who showed up when something needed doing and did it without being asked. Samuel Reed was 20, from a small town in East Texas, young enough that he still wore his uncertainty on his face like a weather report. He was the one who started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill every few days, stuck into an old tin cup with water, which he never acknowledged and Ada never questioned. The town of Calla Ridge introduced itself to her in stages. She went in on Saturdays with Andrew for the weekly supply run, and the town got used to seeing her, first with curiosity, and then with the particular small-town friendliness of people who have decided that a newcomer intends to stay. The storekeeper's wife, Clara Denny, was the first to invite Ada to a quilting circle that met on Thursday evenings at the church foundation, under a canvas awning that served as a roof until the real one could be built. Clara Denny was stout and direct and laughed like she meant it, and Ada decided within the first 5 minutes of knowing her that she was the kind of woman worth knowing. At the quilting circle, Ada met the other women of Calla Ridge, the doctor's wife, the school teacher, a Mexican woman named Rosario Vargas who was Dorodio Vargas's wife, and who spoke English with a precise care that made Ada think she had worked hard to acquire it, which Ada respected enormously. Rosario Vargas had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, and she and Ada discovered within the second quilting circle that they agreed on most of the important things, and that the disagreements they did have were the kind that made conversation better rather than worse. Ada also noticed, in those early weeks, the particular quality of the injustice that the land held alongside its beauty. She watched Dorodio Vargas and his wife navigate the town with a careful dignity that she understood was armor, watched the way certain men in the saloon looked through them, and watched the way Sheriff Grady Moss applied his sobriety and his justice unevenly in a way that she thought was both obvious and unacceptable. She and Rosario Vargas talked about it one afternoon over coffee at the Vargas kitchen table, the two of them playing with each other in the way of women who are tired of being polite about things that matter. "This land was Mexican land before it was American," Rosario said. "My husband's family's land. The treaty said we would keep our rights, but a treaty is only as good as the people who are supposed to honor it, and you see for yourself how that is going." Ada did see. She had grown up in Virginia in the aftermath of the war, in a city rearranging itself around damage that everyone was pretending was already healed, and she knew what it looked like when a society decided that certain people's grief was inconvenient. She could not fix the land politics of the New Mexico territory, but she could make sure her own conduct toward the Vargas family was honest, and she could say plainly to Clara Denny and the other women at the quilting circle that she thought Sheriff Moss's selective enforcement was wrong, which she did, on a Thursday in May, and which caused a silence and then a more honest conversation than any of them had probably expected to have. She told Andrew about it that evening over supper. He listened without interruption, which was one of the things about him she was beginning to understand was characteristic. He did not interrupt because he was actually listening, not waiting for his turn to talk. "You said that out loud in the quilting circle," he said when she was done. "I did. How did Clara Denny take it?" "Better than I expected. She said her husband has had words with Moss about it twice already." Andrew was quiet for a moment, moving his fork through his beans. "Dorodio Vargas is a good man and a good neighbor," he said. "He has more right to this land than Moss has to his badge, and most people with sense know it." He paused. "I am glad you said it." That was when she knew. Not all at once, not with trumpets, but the way you know something that has been growing quietly in the corner of your awareness and finally steps into the light. She was looking at him across the supper table, at his bent head and his honest hands, and the way he had said those words like they were simply true and therefore required saying. And she knew that she was in considerable danger of falling in love with Andrew Ashford. She put the knowledge away and went to wash the dishes. The summer came in hard and fast the way New Mexico summers do, bringing a heat that pressed down on the earth like a hand pressing dough, and a sky so blue and cloudless it looked like ambition. The cattle needed more water and more attention in the heat, and Andrew and his hands were out from dawn to dusk most days, and Ada managed the ranch house and the garden and the chickens and the weekly ledger accounts, and still had energy left in the evenings to sit on the porch with a book she had borrowed from the school teacher, reading while the sky went orange and then purple, and then full of stars that seemed to her, every night, to be an excess of beauty. Andrew had a habit of sitting on the porch after supper, not every night but most of them. He would bring his coffee and sometimes a piece of the leather harness or tack he was mending, and he would sit in the other chair, and they would exist together in a quiet that was nothing like the quiet of loneliness. It was the quiet of two people who had found that the other's company made silence comfortable rather than awkward, and Ada had not experienced that before with any person who was not her father, and she held it carefully. They talked on those evenings, sometimes a little, sometimes a great deal. He told her about Missouri, about the family farm that had been worn out by the time he was old enough to work it, about the railroad job that had taken him west and given him his first taste of this country's enormous geography. She told him about Richmond, about her father and his patient competence, about the years of sewing and laundry and saving, about the paper in her boot. That came out on a July evening when the heat had not let go even after dark, and the frogs in the stock pond were loud enough to hear from the porch. She did not plan to tell him. It came out the way some things do, when the right quiet has been established and the right company is present and the thing is simply ready to be said. "I still have the paper," she said. "The one Fletcher Doyle gave me with your name on it." He turned his head to look at her. In the lamplight from the window she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. "You kept it." "In my boot, left boot in the toe. I kept it the entire 7 years." He was quiet for a moment. The frogs went on singing. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Because it was the one thing that felt like a direction," she said. "When everything else had stopped making sense, that paper was a direction. And I needed to believe that directions were real." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, and she met his gaze because she had learned by now that he meant nothing unkind by directness, that for him it was simply the most efficient form of honesty. "I am glad Fletcher Doyle gave it to you," he said. "So am I," she said. They sat with that for a while, and then he said, quietly and carefully, as though he had been considering the words for some time, "You have made this house feel like something it has not felt like in a long while." "What has it felt like?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Like a working place," he said, "which it was, which it needed to be. But a working place is not the same as a home." He paused. "It feels like a home now." Ada looked out at the dark where the stars were and felt the words settle into her like warmth into cold ground. She did not say anything for a moment because she was afraid of how her voice might come out if she used it. Then she said simply, "Good. That is what I was hoping for." The summer deepened. The cattle drive to the railhead in Las Vegas, New Mexico was scheduled for August, which meant Andrew and Eli Cooper and Samuel Reed would be gone for 3 weeks driving the herd north. Ada had known this was coming, had known it since April, and had told herself it would not affect her. 3 weeks was not long. She was capable of managing the ranch house alone for 3 weeks. She had managed alone for much longer than that. The morning they left, she stood on the porch and watched them go, Andrew on Cora and Eli and Samuel on their own horses, the cattle moving in a great dusty shifting mass ahead of them, the dogs working the edges with purposeful concentration. Andrew turned in the saddle before the trail bent and he was out of sight, and he lifted his hand, and she lifted hers. She told herself the ache in her chest was simply the adjustment of routine. She spent the 3 weeks being productive. She replastered a section of the kitchen wall where the adobe had begun to crack. She put up 7 jars of pickled green beans from the garden. She recategorized the supply ledger in a way that made the accounts easier to follow. She went a quilting circle on Thursday evenings and had supper with the Vargas family twice, and on the second visit, Rosario Vargas looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup with the eyes of a woman who sees clearly and said, "You miss him." "I miss the routine," Ada said. Rosario made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I miss him," Ada said. "Yes," Rosario said. "I thought so." It was a good 3 weeks for productivity and a difficult 3 weeks for sleep, and when she heard horses on the road on the 22nd day and went to the porch and saw them coming, all 3 of them, dusty and trail-worn and exactly right, she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Andrew swung down from Cora and handed the reins to Samuel without taking his eyes off her face. "The house is still standing," he said. "I replastered the kitchen wall," she said. Something in his face shifted, and he stepped up onto the porch and stopped close to her, closer than was strictly necessary given the available space, and she did not step back. "You replastered the wall," he said, and there was something in his voice that she could not look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at bright light. "It needed doing," she said. "Ada," he said. And then something happened that neither of them had planned for, or perhaps both of them had been planning without knowing it, in the private way that the heart plans things it has not yet consulted the mind about. He reached up and touched her face, just her jaw, just his fingers along her jaw, and she closed her eyes and leaned into his hand the way a plant leans toward the sun, without intention, without thinking about it, simply because it is the direction of light and warmth. "I thought about you the whole way north and the whole way back," he said. "I thought about you the whole time you were gone," she said. "That seems relevant," he said. "It does," she said. He kissed her gently, briefly, like a question, and she answered it without hesitation, because she had been carrying his name in her boot for 7 years, and she was done waiting for the world to give her permission to want something for herself. Behind them, from the direction of the barn, they heard Samuel Reed make a sound that was probably a deliberate cough, and Eli Cooper's voice saying dryly, "Come on, boy, those horses need water," and then the sound of their boots on the ground moving away. Ada laughed against Andrew's mouth, and he pulled back and looked at her with the kind of expression she had seen in his letters but not yet on his face, the expression of a man who has gotten to something true and means to stay there. "I suppose we should talk," he said. "I suppose we should," she said. "But not yet." He kissed her again, and the August evening went golden around them, and the mountains to the west turned rose and then purple, and the chickens made their evening sounds in the yard, and everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. They talked that night on the porch, after supper, after the dishes, after Eli and Samuel had gone to the bunkhouse, and the stars had come out in their usual ridiculous abundance. He told her that he had not planned for this. He said it plainly and without apology, because that was how he said things. He had not planned to feel this way about the woman who came to work for him, and he did not want her to feel that anything she had was contingent on her feeling the same way, because her position here was not contingent on anything except her work, which had been extraordinary, and he needed her to understand that. She listened to all of it with the patience of a woman who has spent 7 years learning patience, and then she said, "Andrew, I have been falling in love with you since July. I have been trying not to because I was not sure you felt the same way and I did not want to make the situation uncomfortable." He stared at her. "Since July," she said. "When you said you were glad I said the thing to the quilting circle about Doroteo Vargas." "That is what did it," he said. "That is what confirmed it," she said. The falling had already started. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the ground and then looked up at her with an expression that was almost helpless in its honesty. "I wrote you a letter," he said, "in March, before you left Richmond. A third letter after my second reply. I wrote it and then I did not send it." "What did it say?" "It said that I was looking forward to meeting you more than I had looked forward to anything in some time, and that I thought that probably meant something, and that I hoped you were well and not finding the wait too difficult." He paused. "I thought it was too much to say, so I did not send it." Ada looked at him for a long moment. "Andrew Ashford," she said. "We have been wasting time." He laughed, which was a sound she had heard only occasionally and which she decided she was going to make a personal project of hearing more often. It was a full, genuine sound, nothing held back. "I suppose we have," he said. She reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a long time while the frogs sang, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet. It was not a sudden thing, what came after. It was a careful, honest, incremental thing, which was appropriate for two people who were both, in their different ways, careful and honest. He asked her to come to the autumn social in Calla Ridge with him in September, as his companion rather than his employee, which distinction he made plainly and which she appreciated. They danced together in the cleared space behind the general store, to the music of a fiddle and a battered piano that someone had hauled out to the street on a cart, and she learned that Andrew Ashford was not a natural dancer, but was a committed one, which told you everything you needed to know about him. Clara Denny watched them from the edge of the dancing area with an expression of enormous satisfaction. Rosario Vargas, dancing with Doroteo, caught Ada's eye across the crowd and smiled with all her teeth. The autumn was the most beautiful season Ada had ever experienced, and she had not expected that. Virginia autumns were beautiful too, all that red and gold burning through the canopy, but this was something different. The New Mexico autumn was subtler, the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow in a way that seemed to light the air around them, the light itself thickening into something golden and honey-warm, the mornings cold and the afternoons mild, and the evenings carrying a sharpness that made everything feel more vivid. She and Andrew rode out together on the Saturday afternoons when the work allowed it, which was not every week, but was often enough to become something they both planned for. He showed her the land in the way of someone who has learned to love a place over a long time, pointing out things she would have missed otherwise. The way the light fell on the red cliffs at a certain hour, the spring that ran clean and cold from between two boulders in a canyon that you would never find without knowing it was there, the place on the eastern ridge where you could see for 50 miles on a clear day, the whole territory spread out below you like a map of everything important. She began to understand why he had stayed. She began to feel in her own chest the beginnings of the same understanding, the sense that a place could claim you if you let it, if you opened yourself to its particular terms. On one of those Saturday rides in October, they stopped on the ridge and looked out at the 50-mile view, Cora and his big bay, Jackson, standing patient and still beside them. The air was clear and cold, and the sky was the saturated blue of deep autumn. "Do you miss Virginia?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss the smell of the magnolias in April, but no, I do not miss Virginia." She looked out at the distance. "This is where I am supposed to be." He looked at her profile for a moment. "I believe that," he said. "Do you?" she said, turning to look at him. "I have believed it since the morning I saw you walking toward the well," he said. She felt it move through her, that sentence, all the way down. She had believed it too, she realized from that same moment, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, that the 7 years of waiting and the paper in the boot and all the laundry and sewing and the long, winding journey had been entirely worth it. He asked her to marry him in November. He did not do it with a great deal of theatrical preparation. That was not how he was, and she would not have wanted it to be. He did it on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp between them casting its steady light, the ledger open from where they had been going over the winter accounts together, which was something he had started asking her help with in September, and which she suspected was partly practical and partly an excuse to sit with her for another hour in the evenings. He looked up from the ledger and looked at her and said, "Ada, I would like to ask you to marry me, if that is something you would want. Not because it is the proper arrangement for two people living on the same property. Because I love you and I cannot imagine this place or my life without you, and I think you know that I mean that with full seriousness." She put her pen down on the page. She looked at him across the lamp and thought about the paper in her boot, worn soft as cloth, and the name on it that had been her direction when she had no other, and the morning she walked toward the well and everything changed. "Yes," she said. "Andrew, yes." He let out a breath that she thought had been waiting for her answer for some time. He reached across the ledger and took both her hands in his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a moment, the accounts forgotten, the winter outside the window beginning to be beautiful rather than merely cold. They were married in December of 1883, in the Calla Ridge Church, which by December had a partial roof and enough walls to keep the worst of the wind out. The minister was a gentle, large-handed man named Reverend Calloway, who performed the ceremony with simple dignity. Clara Denny wept happily in the second pew. Rosario and Doroteo Vargas sat beside her, Rosario with her spine straight and her expression full of the particular pleasure of a woman who has been right about something important. Eli Cooper and Samuel Reed stood in the back in their clean shirts looking profoundly uncomfortable with ceremony but present for it, which was what mattered. Old Pete came from town, moving slowly on his bad knee, and sat near the front and wiped his eyes when Ada came down the aisle in the dress she had made herself, the best fabric she had been able to find in Clara Denny's store, a deep blue-green that was not fashionable in the current Eastern style, but that was the right color for the landscape outside the window. Andrew waited for her at the front of the church in his good suit, which she had learned was the only suit he owned, and which he wore with the reluctant dignity of a man who understands that some occasions require it. He watched her walk toward him with an expression that was open in a way she had only seen on his face in private moments, all the careful reserve set aside, just him, and what he felt without any of the usual protection around it. And she thought, as she reached him and took his hands, that she would love him for the rest of her life. She was sure of it the way she was sure of the ground under her boots. The winter settled over the ranch like a white quiet. Ada had not known New Mexico winters, had assumed from the heat of the summer that winter would be mild. But the high desert in December and January was not mild. It was cold, genuinely cold, with frosts that turned the ground silver and occasional snows that came sideways on the wind and lay in drifts against the fence posts and the north side of the barn. They moved the cattle to the lower pastures where there was shelter, and supplemented the grazing with hay from the barn. And the days were short and the work was hard, and the evenings were long and warm and full of lamplight. Ada learned that winter that marriage was a different territory from courtship, not worse, but different, with its own particular landscape to learn. She learned that Andrew was not a morning person in the deep winter, that he needed coffee before he was fully himself, that he had a habit of reading old newspapers weeks after the fact as if the information might have changed, that he talked in his sleep occasionally in low, incomplete sentences that she found endearing, and that he was embarrassed about. She learned that he was gentle and patient, and sometimes stubborn in a way that was almost always about principle rather than preference. She learned that his hands were never still, that when he was sitting quietly, he was usually mending something or sharpening something, or doing some small productive task with those capable hands, and she found that she loved this about him without reservation. He learned things about her too. He learned that she was more resilient than she looked and less patient than she seemed, that the patience was real but had a bottom to it, and that when she hit the bottom she was very direct about it, which he said he respected. He learned that she could calculate a sum in her head faster than he could do it on paper, and that she had opinions about the arrangement of the barn that were, in fact, better than the arrangement he had been using for 11 years, which he acknowledged and implemented without any of the stubbornness that some men would have brought to the situation. He learned that she cried at some things he would not have predicted, and not at things he would have, that she had her father's habit of standing at the window in the morning looking out at the distance before she was ready to speak, and that he could love her quietly in those moments without needing her to know he was watching. The spring of 1884 came with great drama, the way New Mexico springs do, thunderstorms rolling in off the mountains with a majesty that could make you understand how people had come to believe in gods. Ada stood on the porch and watched the storms move in and felt the electricity in the air that preceded them, and thought that she had never been so completely alive to the world as she was in this place. In April of 1884, she told Andrew she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before the hands were up, while the coffee was boiling on the stove and the light outside was just beginning to be more than dark. She told him plainly because that was how they talked to each other, and she watched his face do several things in rapid succession, surprise and then something overwhelmed, and then something that settled into a joy so complete it made him look younger. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and then said into her hair, "Ada, Ada." "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" he said, pulling back to look at her. "I am very well," she said. "I am perfectly healthy and not frightened, and I would like my coffee now." He laughed, his arms still around her. "Yes," he said, "of course coffee, Andrew, yes. You are going to need to let go of me to pour it." He did not let go of her for another several seconds, and she did not ask again. The pregnancy was good, which she was grateful for, and did not take for granted. She had known women in Richmond for whom it was not, and she knew enough about the difficulty of medical care in the territory to be aware that things could go badly and did, for too many women. The doctor in Calla Ridge, a compact, efficient man named Dr. Hensley, came out to the ranch in May and told her everything was as it should be, and that she had the constitution of someone who had spent years doing hard physical work, which she took as a compliment. She kept working through the spring and into the early summer, which Andrew worried about more than she thought was strictly warranted. She told him that she was capable of determining her own limits, and that she would tell him when she needed to slow down, and he said he knew that, and he still hovered, which she decided to find endearing rather than irritating because it was clearly coming from love and not from doubt. The summer of 1884 was a busy and beautiful one. The ranch was doing well. The Hereford Cross cattle were producing better than the old Longhorn stock, and Andrew had negotiated a standing contract with a cattle buyer in Las Vegas that meant the year's income was more predictable than it had been. Samuel Reed, the young hand from Texas, had grown into his responsibilities in a way that made him indispensable, and Andrew had given him a pay increase that he accepted with a quiet gratitude that said it had made a material difference to him. The town of Calla Ridge finished its church roof in June, and the community organized a proper dedication service that turned into a full-day celebration, with food brought by every family and children running in the streets, and the piano dragged back out to the cleared space behind the store for dancing in the evening. Ada, large with her pregnancy by then, did not dance but sat with Rosario Vargas and Clara Denny and watched the town be itself, warm and flawed and alive, and felt a belonging that she had not felt since her father was alive and the house in Richmond was still whole. "You look like a woman who has found her place," Rosario said. "I have," Ada said. "Good," Rosario said. "You were looking for it for long enough." 7 years, Ada said. Rosario raised her coffee cup. "Then let us say it was exactly long enough and not 1 day more." Ada raised her own cup and they drank to that, and across the cleared space Andrew caught her eye and she smiled back with everything she had. Their son was born on a September morning in 1884 in the back bedroom with the window that looked toward the mountains. Dr. Hensley was there, and Rosario Vargas, who had delivered half the babies in the territory as far as Ada could tell, and who managed the whole proceeding with a calm authority that Ada clung to like a rope in a river. Andrew waited in the main room, which was where he had been sent and where he remained, though she heard him stop pacing every time she made a sound and knew he was standing very still and listening. The baby came in the early afternoon, and when Rosario put him in Ada's arms, he was red and furious and absolutely himself, already decided about the world. "He is well," Ada said. "He is extremely well," Rosario said. "He is loud and he is angry and he is healthy." Ada looked at her son's face, still unfamiliar and already entirely beloved, and called for Andrew. He came through the door with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her and looked at the child in her arms with a wonder that she thought could have lit the room. "He looks like he has opinions," Andrew said. "He has already expressed several," Ada said. Andrew reached out and let the baby grip his finger, which the baby did with an immediate and ferocious certainty. Andrew's throat moved. "Silas," he said. It was the name they had agreed on in June after a good deal of discussion. "Silas Thomas Ashford." "Hello, Silas," Ada said. Outside the window, the mountains were going their autumn rose in the afternoon light, and the windmill was turning in the breeze, and somewhere Eli Cooper was whistling something tuneless while he worked, and the world was exactly the size and shape and weight that it was supposed to be. They christened Silas in the finished church in October, on a cool, bright morning that smelled like cedar and turned leaves, and the whole town came because towns like Calla Ridge showed up for each other's occasions, which was one of the things Ada had grown to love about it. Silas grew the way healthy babies do, with tremendous speed and a personality that began to declare itself within the first weeks. He was a boy who was alert to everything, who watched the world from Ada's arms with those brown eyes that were entirely his father's, taking in information with a focused interest that made Andrew say more than once that the boy was going to be a hand raiser at school, which Ada said was not a problem. The years that followed were the years of making, in the fullest sense. The ranch expanded when Andrew bought the adjacent parcel from a rancher who was moving back east, which added another 100 acres of good grassland and a second water source that made the dry summers easier to manage. They hired a third hand, a quiet man named Gabriel Ruiz, who had worked in the territory his whole life and knew the land the way some people know music, intuitively and entirely. With Gabriel Ruiz came a different and better approach to the cattle's seasonal movement that improved the grazing significantly. The house grew too, literally. Andrew built an addition on the east end that added a proper bedroom for Silas when he was old enough for one, and a room that Ada turned into a sitting room where the quilting circle sometimes met, which meant the improvement served the whole town in a small way. And Ada herself grew into the place with the whole strength of her particular character. She kept the accounts and the kitchen garden. She taught herself to ride well enough to help with the cattle on the days when an extra person was needed. She became, in her 4th year in Calla Ridge, a kind of informal advocate for the women of the community who needed help with legal matters they did not know how to navigate, writing letters on their behalf to the territorial government, helping them understand the documents they were expected to sign, sitting beside them in Sheriff Moss's office when they needed to report something and were uncertain of their standing. Sheriff Moss, for his part, had improved somewhat under the weight of community expectation and the influence of his wife, who had been one of the women Ada helped with a property dispute in 1885, and who had thereafter appointed herself a quiet but consistent voice in her husband's ear. He was not a transformed man, but he was a more careful one, and in a frontier town in 1886, careful was a reasonable aspiration. In the spring of 1886, Ada discovered she was expecting again. She told Andrew in the same kitchen on a Tuesday morning with the coffee boiling, and he crossed the kitchen in the same 3 steps and held her face in both hands, and she laughed and said, "You do not need to look that surprised. We have been married 2.5 years. "I am not surprised," he said. "I am grateful." "That is a better answer," she said. This pregnancy was different from the first in the way that second pregnancies often are. A different weight distribution, a different rhythm of tiredness, a different particular discomfort that she managed with the same practical determination she brought to everything. She was 32 years old, which was not young for a second pregnancy in 1886, and Dr. Hensley was attentive without being alarmist, which she appreciated. Silas, who was almost 2, was a significant distraction from any anxiety she might otherwise have allowed herself, because a nearly 2-year-old in a ranch house is a full-time endeavor that leaves little room for other preoccupations. He had Andrew's directness and her stubbornness and a laugh that belonged entirely to itself, and he had decided that the chickens were personally responsible for many of the world's injustices, which provided daily entertainment. Andrew was steady through those months. He had always been steady. It was one of the foundations of who he was, but she had not known until she was pregnant with Silas how specifically that steadiness would express itself in a crisis, real or imagined. He did not minimize her concerns or inflate them. He helped with what needed helping with and left alone what did not. He sat with her in the evenings and read aloud from the newspaper or the almanac, or sometimes from the books he was slowly accumulating from the traveling bookseller who came through Calla Ridge twice a year, because she had told him once that she loved the sound of his voice, and he had never forgotten it. Their daughter arrived in November of 1886, on a day when the first real snow of the season was falling past the window in heavy, deliberate flakes. She came easier than Silas had, though Ada would not have predicted that. Rosario Vargas was there again, Dr. Hensley was there, and Andrew waited again in the main room and was very still when she cried. She was smaller than Sela's had been, with Ada's nose and Andrew's jaw and a quality of stillness that was different from her brother's restless attention. Where Sela's was loud and immediate, this baby was quiet and watchful in a way that suggested she was already thinking. They named her Eliza Ruth Ashford. Andrew said Eliza when he first held her, sitting on the edge of the bed in the lamplight with the snow still falling outside, and the name settled onto the baby like it had been waiting for her. Silas, when he was introduced to his sister the following morning, regarded her with the grave suspicion of a person confronted with irreversible change, and then poked her cheek very gently with one finger and said, "Baby," in a tone of scientific discovery, and Ada thought she might never be happier than she was in that exact moment. But she was happier, in increments, as the months and then the years moved them forward. That was the thing she had not known when she was 22 and the world had stopped making sense. That happiness was not a destination you arrived at and then stayed in, but a quality that accreted, that built itself in layers, each one adding to the last, so that by the time you looked back you could see the whole structure of it and understand how it had been built and be astonished by the cumulative weight of ordinary good things. Christmas of 1886 was the first one that felt entirely like her own Christmas, her own traditions in her own house with her husband and her children. She made the things her father had always made for Christmas, a molasses cake and a particular biscuit with dried fruit in it that he had learned from someone she had never known, and she made them in her own kitchen with Andrew sitting at the table keeping her company and Sela's underfoot and Eliza in her cradle by the stove. And the house smelled like cedar and molasses and wood smoke, and outside the snow had made everything white and still, and the stars were enormous. Andrew gave her that Christmas a small leather-bound journal blank inside, with her name stamped in gold on the cover. He said he thought she might want to write things down, that she had a way with words that he thought deserved more than letters and account books. She looked at the journal and then at him and said, "You pay attention." "To you?" he said. "Yes, constantly." She wrote in the journal that same evening, after the children were asleep and Andrew had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire with his boots still on, which was a habit she had given up trying to change. She wrote about the year, about Eliza's arrival and Silas's new words and the way the snow looked on the mountains in the afternoon light, and then she wrote about Andrew, the specific and particular ways he was himself, the rolled-up sleeves and the patient hands and the way he listened with his whole face. And she wrote, at the bottom of the first page, "I carried his name in my boot for 7 years before I knew him. Now I cannot imagine not knowing him. Now the name is not just a name. It is the whole shape of my life." She kept writing in that journal, and then others like it for years. The late 1880s were good years for the Ashford Ranch and for Calla Ridge, which grew in that period from a collection of a few dozen families to a proper town, with a completed church and a proper schoolhouse, and a second store, and a weekly newspaper printed on a hand press in the back of the general store by the storekeeper's eldest son, who had ambitions. The New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, which people debated with great energy in the saloon and the quilting circle, and the space behind the general store, where the community tended to sort out its opinions. Ada had opinions about statehood and about the terms on which it should come, particularly regarding the land rights of the families who had been in the territory before it was American territory, a population that included the Vargas family and many others whose situation she understood better after years of friendship with Rosario. She wrote a letter to the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe on the subject that Rosario helped her make accurate in its legal particulars, and the letter was published, and Clara Denny's husband read it aloud at the town meeting to general approval from some quarters and a cold silence from others, which she had expected, and which did not change her position. Andrew read the letter in the territorial newspaper and said, across the supper table, "This is excellent writing." "Rosario helped with the land law sections," Ada said. "That does not make it less excellent," he said. "The argument is yours." "It is ours," she said, "this community's." He looked at her with that expression she had grown to know so well, the one that was half admiration and half something more private and more warm. "Yes," he said, "it is." In 1888, Silas started school. The schoolhouse was a single room with 12 students and a teacher named Miss Beaumont, who was 24 years old and had come from Illinois, and who handled 12 students of varying ages and capabilities with a composure that Ada found impressive. Silas went on the first morning with his jaw set in a way that was purely Andrew, holding Ada's hand, but not because he needed to, because the gesture was still available to him, and he was not yet at the age when he would stop using it. He came home that afternoon full of information about everything that had happened, delivered in a continuous tumble that did not seem to require any participation from Ada beyond her physical presence. And Andrew listened to the whole account at the supper table with the same attention he gave to everything important, which was everything his children said, without exception. Eliza was too, and she watched her brother with the focused attention that Ada had come to recognize as her daughter's primary mode of engaging with the world. Eliza spoke later than Silas had, but when she began she spoke in complete sentences, as though she had been composing them in private for some time and had simply been waiting until she had them right. The decade turned. 1890 arrived, and with it, the particular forward momentum of a community that had found its pace. The railroad came closer, a branch line extending through the territory that would eventually reach within 30 miles of Calla Ridge, which changed the economics of ranching in ways that Andrew had anticipated and planned for, renegotiating his cattle contracts with the foresight of a man who understood that the world changes and that the best response to change is preparation rather than resistance. Old Pete died in the spring of 1890, peacefully, in his daughter's house in Calla Ridge, at the age of 73. Ada went to the funeral with Andrew and held his arm through the graveside service, because Pete had been part of the ranch's history, and Andrew had known him for a long time, and grief is the price of that kind of knowing. Afterward, standing at the grave in the mild spring air with the smell of new growth on the breeze, Andrew was quiet in the way he was quiet when something had settled into him that he would carry for a while, and she did not fill the quiet with words but simply stayed beside him, because that was one of the things you could do for someone you loved. You could be present in their grief without trying to fix it. Doroteo Vargas died in the summer of 1891, of a sudden illness that took him in 3 days, which was fast enough to be a shock to everyone who had known him as a large, vital man full of energy and opinion. Rosario was devastated and magnificent in her devastation, which was to say she kept going, kept managing her household and her land with a precision that Ada knew was partly Rosario's nature, and partly the armor that she had built for herself over a lifetime of needing it. Ada went to Rosario's house every day for a week after the funeral, sometimes with food and sometimes with nothing but her presence and her willingness to sit and listen if Rosario wanted to talk, and to be silent if she did not. On the third day, Rosario talked for 2 hours about Doroteo, about their life together, about the land dispute that had taken 5 years to settle, and which they had settled together with the determination of 2 people who understood that some things were worth fighting for over time. On the 4th day, Rosario did not talk at all, just sat with Ada on the porch in the afternoon light and looked at the mountains. On the 5th day, Rosario looked at Ada over her coffee cup and said, "You are a good friend, Ada Ashford." "You would do the same," Ada said. "I would," Rosario agreed. "But that does not make it worth less that you are doing it." The Vargas land passed to Rosario legally, which was not guaranteed in the territory at that time, and which required the help of a lawyer from Santa Fe and the letter-writing skills of Ada and the quiet but persistent advocacy of Andrew, who made 3 trips into town to speak plainly with the relevant officials about the legal obligations that the treaty had established, in the same measured, direct way that he spoke plainly about everything, which was sometimes more effective than a louder approach. The land was secured. Rosario stayed on it. Her eldest son, Marcos, came from Las Cruces to help manage it, and gradually the Vargas ranch found its new shape, smaller and different but intact. The summer of 1892 brought a drought that was hard on everyone in the territory. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Ashford property dropped to a trickle by July, and the stock pond that the cattle used as a primary summer water source fell dangerously low. Andrew and Gabriel Ruiz worked on the problem for 3 weeks, diverting water from the spring in the canyon, which was lower than usual but still running, and extending the trough system to reach the lower pastures where the cattle had been moved. It was hard work in brutal heat, and Ada managed the ranch house through it with a kind of focused efficiency that felt like the truest expression of who she was, keeping the household fed and the accounts maintained, and making sure that Eli Cooper, who was getting on in years and felt the heat badly, did not overwork himself without anyone noticing. Silas, at 8 years old, was already helping with real work, not the token tasks of a small child but genuine contributions, carrying water, feeding livestock, doing fence checks on the sections close to the house. He had Andrew's steadiness and Ada's quickness, and he was turning into a person she found endlessly interesting to watch, all that character still in formation, still deciding what it was going to be. Eliza was 6, and her focused intelligence had turned toward books with an intensity that suggested Miss Beaumont's schoolroom was going to find her a stimulating presence. She read everything she could get her hands on, which in Calla Ridge was limited to the school reader, the Bible, the almanac, and the books that the traveling bookseller brought twice a year, which meant Andrew increased his order from the bookseller that year and watched his daughter work her way through each new volume with a satisfaction he did not entirely hide. The drought broke in August with a week of storms that came one after another like thoughts in a series, each one dropping rain in quantities that the parched ground struggled to absorb fast enough. The creek rose, the stock pond refilled, and the land came back from its own particular version of thirst with a vivid green that Ada had not seen in New Mexico before, as if the land was showing what it had been hiding all summer. She stood on the porch in the rain on the second afternoon of the storms and let it fall on her face, and Andrew came out and stood beside her and did the same, and they were both laughing after a moment because the relief of it was too large to hold without some kind of release. "We made it through," she said. "We always make it through," he said. "Do not be superstitious," she said. "I am not superstitious," he said. "I am observant." He looked at her with rain on his face and in his hair, and she thought he was the most real person she had ever known, real in the way that means genuinely and completely and without artifice themselves. We make it through because we handle things as they come, together. She reached out and took his hand in the rain. "Together," she agreed. They stood on the porch until the rain let up, and then he went back to the barn and she went back to the kitchen, and the evening was the smell of wet earth and cedar and supper cooking, and the children came in with mud on their boots, and she made them take them off at the door, and the lamp came on against the dusk, and it was the most ordinary beautiful evening in the world. The 1890s continued to bring the ranch and the family through their particular seasons of difficulty and ease. The railroad extension reached its nearest point in 1893, which changed the cattle business enough that Andrew made 2 trips to the railhead in that first year to negotiate new terms, and the terms he came back with were good enough that he was able to pay off the last of the mortgage on the additional land he had bought in 1885. Which was a thing he marked by sitting quietly at the kitchen table for a moment after he had signed the final papers. And Ada put her hand on his shoulder, and he covered it with his. Eli Cooper retired in 1894, at 61, with enough saved from his years on the ranch to live modestly on the edge of Calla Ridge, which he did for several years more in a small house with a garden that he kept with the same quiet competence he had brought to everything. He came out to the ranch sometimes, on no particular schedule, just appearing when the spirit moved him, and sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the land with the expression of a man who had given years to a place and still found it worth looking at. Samuel Reed, who had come to the ranch at 20 in 1883 and was now 31, had taken Eli's role as the senior hand, managing the day-to-day operations with a capability that had grown alongside his years. He had married a woman named Josephine the previous spring, a capable, forthright woman who was the schoolteacher Miss Beaumont's younger sister, and who had come to visit and decided she liked the territory better than Illinois. They lived in the expanded bunkhouse that Andrew had improved to accommodate a married couple, and Ada liked Josephine very much, liked her plainness and her humor and her willingness to say exactly what she thought about any subject, which was a quality Ada had always admired. Silas was 10 in 1894, and he was his father's son in the most complete sense, steady and capable and honest, with a facility for the practical work of the ranch that was obvious and natural. He knew the cattle already better than most adults, could read the signs of illness before Andrew could sometimes, and moved through the work with the ease of someone who has found what they are for. But he had also inherited Ada's restlessness and her habit of reading everything available, and there was something in him that she thought was looking at the horizon in a way that she recognized, because she had looked at it herself. Eliza was 8, and she had decided she was going to be a teacher, a decision she had arrived at with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict, and which nobody who knew her doubted she would achieve. Ada told Andrew one evening that watching their children was like watching two versions of themselves mixed together in new combinations, and Andrew said that was either a wonderful thing or a warning, and she said she thought it was both. In 1895, Ada found herself expecting their third child. She was 41 years old, which was late for a third child, and Dr. Hensley was appropriately careful about it, which she allowed him to be without argument because she was not 25 anymore, and she understood the arithmetic of risk. She was not frightened exactly, but she was more aware of uncertainty than she had been in the previous pregnancies, and she let herself be aware of it rather than pushing it down, because she had learned that pushing things down did not make them go away. It just moved them where they were harder to address. Andrew was the same steady presence he had always been, with an additional quality of attentiveness that she thought was partly his own awareness of the same risks and partly his particular form of love, which had always expressed itself most clearly in presence and in paying close attention. He was more deliberate about being in the house in the evenings, more deliberate about the small physical gestures, a hand on her back when she stood at the stove, coffee brought to her before she could get up for it, the kind of consideration that she had never needed to ask for because he had always offered it, but which in this period felt more conscious, more chosen. "I am going to be fine," she told him in August when the summer heat was heavy and the pregnancy was at its most physically difficult. "I know," he said. "I am just here." "You are always just here," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is the plan." The child was born in October of 1895, a boy, smaller than Silas had been but loud and vigorous, delivered in the same back bedroom by a combination of Rosario Vargas, Josephine Reed, and Dr. Hensley, with Andrew in the main room doing what he had always done, being very still and listening. Ada held the baby and felt the relief of it move through her in a wave that she had not fully known she was waiting for until it arrived. They named him Thomas Fletcher Ashford, Thomas for Andrew's father, who had been a good man in Missouri, Fletcher for Fletcher Doyle, who had given a young woman in a Virginia parlor a piece of paper with a name on it and told her it was a direction. Andrew held Thomas in the lamplight in the October evening, and Silas stood beside the bed with the careful gravity of a 12-year-old who understands that something significant has occurred, and Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her new brother with the same focused analytical attention she brought to everything worth knowing. "He is small," Eliza said. "He will grow," Ada said. "Silas was small," Eliza said with the tone of scientific reference. "I was not small," Silas said with 10-year-old's dignity. "You were very small," Ada said. "You grew." Andrew looked up from the baby's face at Ada's face, and what passed between them in that look was the whole of what they had built together. The 7 years of waiting and the long journey, and the morning at the well, and all the mornings and evenings since. The supper tables and the cattle drives and the drought and the rain and the birth of each child and the death of people they had loved and the letters to the territorial newspaper and the quilting circles and the porch evenings and the 50-mile view from the ridge. All of it contained in a single shared look between two people who had grown into each other the way trees grow together when they are planted close, roots intertwined and trunks parallel and the whole structure stronger for the proximity. "I love you," his eyes said. "I know," hers said back. "I love you too." The years that followed Thomas's birth were years of a particular fullness. The ranch was established and profitable. The family was whole. Calla Ridge had become, in the 20-some years since Ada had arrived on a freight wagon with her traveling case and her worn-out paper in her boot, a proper town with ambitions toward the future that included the territory's eventual statehood and all the changes that would bring. Silas grew into a young man who had his father's way with the land and cattle, and who, at 16, began to show the qualities of judgment that would eventually make him the kind of rancher that the territory needed, fair-minded and far-sighted, the kind who understood that the land was not yours to exhaust, but yours to tend. He had a friendship with Marcos Vargas's youngest son, a boy his own age named Rafael. That was the kind of friendship that forms between people who see the world in compatible ways, and which Ada thought was one of the best things she could have hoped for her son, because the friendships you choose in adolescence say something about who you are becoming. Eliza, true to her declaration at 8 years old, was the most serious student Miss Beaumont's schoolroom had ever produced, and when the school expanded to 2 rooms in 1898 and brought a second teacher, Eliza was the first student recommended for the advanced instruction. She read voraciously and thought carefully and argued her positions with a precision that made Ada proud and made Andrew say, with barely contained satisfaction, that she got that from her mother. Thomas was the surprise of the 3 of them, not in his personality, which was sunny and sociable from the beginning, but in the particular quality of his imagination. From the time he was old enough to put words together, he told stories, elaborate, inventive narratives about the horses and the cattle and the people in town, full of unexpected detail and emotional truth. He told the stories to anyone who would listen, to Ada while she cooked, to Andrew while he mended tack, to Silas with a captive audience quality that his older brother bore with good-natured patience. Andrew, watching Thomas hold forth at the supper table one evening about the personal feelings of the gray mare Cora's daughter, who had been born the previous spring and was Thomas's primary devotion, said quietly to Ada afterward, "He is going to be a storyteller." "A writer," Ada said. "Perhaps," Andrew said. "We should make sure he has books." They made sure he had books. The traveling booksellers' visits became, in those years, a family event, all 3 children crowding around to see what had come, and Ada and Andrew choosing titles with the accumulated knowledge of 2 parents who knew their children's particular hungers and cared to feed them. Rosario Vargas came to supper on the first Sunday of every month in those years, a tradition they had established after Dorodio died, and which had become one of the constants of Ada's life, something she would have missed like a tooth if it had stopped. Rosario's opinions about the world had not moderated with age. If anything, they had become more precise. She read the newspapers from Santa Fe and Albuquerque that her son Marcos brought when he visited, and she followed the territory's political progress with the attention of a woman who understood that politics was not abstract, but was the thing that determined whether your family kept its land. The New Mexico Territory achieved statehood in 1912, which neither of them lived to see. But in 1895 and 1896 and 1897, as the political conversations moved forward in the newspapers and in the parlors, Ada and Rosario talked about what they hoped the state would look like. And the conversation was always honest and always specific and always hopeful in the way that hope is when it is built on long experience rather than innocence. Andrew turned 50 in 1899, which Ada marked with a supper that included every person she could think of who mattered to him. The remaining ranch hands, the Vargas family, the Reeds, Clara Denny and her husband, Dr. Hensley, the current minister of the now proper Calla Ridge Church, Eli Cooper, who had become slow but was still himself. She had Silas and Eliza and Thomas lay the table with the good cloth that she had made from fabric she had saved for a year, and she cooked the things Andrew loved best: the beef roasted in the adobe oven, the cornbread, the apple preserves from the summer canning. He stood in the kitchen doorway when he came in from the day's work and looked at the full house and the prepared table and all the people in it, and then he looked at Ada, and she thought she saw something that was very close to tears in his eyes, which she had not seen before, not in 16 years of knowing him. "You did all this," he said. "We did," she said. "All of us." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her temple and said quietly, so only she heard, "I did not expect to be this happy." "Neither did I," she said, "but I should have. You told me in your first letter that you would treat me fairly." "I said fairly," he said. "Fair was an understatement," she said. He held her face in both hands, the same gesture he had made in the kitchen in April of 1884 when she told him about Silas, the same gesture she associated now with the fullest expression of what he felt, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been looking at the same face for 16 years and found it more interesting with every year that passed. "I love you, Ada," he said. "I love you, Andrew," she said. And in the room behind them, the supper and the people and the children and the life they had built together continued to happen in all its ordinary fullness, while the autumn evening pressed its rose-gold light through the kitchen window, and the windmill turned in the breeze outside, and the mountains in the distance held their permanent and beautiful quiet. She had carried his name in her boot for 7 years before she walked toward the well and said it to his face. She had spent the 20-odd years since learning every room of the person behind the name, the steady hands and the listening face and the morning silences, and the enormous capacity for work and love that he kept so quietly it would have been easy to mistake for plainness if you were not paying attention. She had been paying attention since the first morning. She would be paying attention for the rest of her life. In the spring of 1900, Ada took the worn paper out of her boot for the last time. It had softened beyond legibility years ago, the ink long since faded to a ghost of itself, but she had kept it out of a habit so old it had become invisible. She sat on the porch on a morning in April, Silas off with the cattle, Eliza at school, Thomas still at the table inside finishing his breakfast, Andrew somewhere between the barn and the corral, doing the first work of the day in the pale early light that she still loved after all these years. She unfolded the paper, which came apart slightly at the creases, and looked at it. She could not read the name any more. She did not need to. She knew it better than she knew her own. She sat with it for a moment, this small soft square that had been her direction when she had no other, that had gotten her through Richmond winters and the long wait and the westbound train and the freight wagon and the 2 miles of road past the church foundation. She held it in her palm and felt the full weight of what it represented, the faith required to keep a thing that long, the particular courage of believing in a name you had not yet attached to a face. Then Andrew came around the corner of the house with his sleeves rolled and his hat pushed back, carrying a bucket of water for the kitchen garden, and he saw her sitting on the porch and altered his course and came up the steps and sat in the chair beside her. "What have you got?" he said, nodding at her palm. She showed him. He looked at the worn paper, not much more than a soft square now, and was quiet. "Fletcher Doyle's paper," he said. "The one with your name on it," she said. "I cannot read the name any more. But I kept it until I did not need it to know the way." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper in her hand. Then he said, "And now?" She looked at the mountains to the west, at the windmill turning, at the kitchen garden coming back in its spring rose, at the man beside her with his good hands and his honest face and his 50 years, worn and real and exactly himself. "Now I know the way," she said. She held the paper for another moment. Then she set it down on the porch rail, and the morning breeze took it quietly without drama, lifting it up and carrying it out past the edge of the porch and over the yard and into the blue spring air, where it turned once, catching the light, and was gone. Andrew reached over and took her hand. She held his, and they sat together in the morning quiet, watching the mountains, watching the windmill turn, watching the season come in green and gold and full of the particular promise that spring makes every year without exception, regardless of how many times it has made it before. The paper was gone. The name was not. It lived in the shape of her days and the warmth of his hands, and the sound of their children in the rooms behind her, and the 20 years of ordinary, extraordinary living that she would not have traded for any other life. Not the easy one in Richmond, not the life of quiet expectations, not any imagined alternative that the world might have offered her in the spring of 1876 when she was 22 and standing in her aunt's front parlor while the magnolias bloomed outside. She had chosen the direction that the name had given her. She had walked toward the well on the morning she arrived. And everything worth having in her life had begun in that moment, and had been growing, patient and strong and daily in hers, ever since. The morning went on around them, the territory doing what it had always done, being enormous and beautiful and indifferent in the way of wild places, requiring everything from the people who chose it and giving back more than they could have predicted. Ada Langston Ashford leaned her head against Andrew Ashford's shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair, and the spring came in over the red hills, and the windmill turned, and the ranch was alive with morning, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything.